Hi everyone. Here we have a conversation about reading Tibetan text, co-sponsored by the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation of Buddhist Studies at the University of Toronto and Wisdom Publications. So today we have Kaia with us, who will be talking about translation. Can you say a few words about yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Kaia Fischer. I'm a translator of Tibetan Buddhist texts I'm based in New York City. I've been translating Tibetan texts for over a decade now, together with my mentor, Dr. Lozang Jamspal, retired from Columbia University, now at International Buddhist College in Sadao, Thailand. So our work is undertaken with the support, editorial and otherwise, of 84,000 translating the words of the Buddha. So today I was asked to talk about the topic of nonviolent translation, which is the rubric that I've been using, or the frame that I've been using, to think about how we might address issues of what's called inclusive language sometimes, or avoiding biased language, taking up those questions in relation to the translation of Tibetan Buddhist texts, especially particularly ancient Tibetan Buddhist texts. In the conversations that I've had with colleagues on the topic, there's one frame that comes up a lot for thinking about this, and it's a frame that I myself used for the better part of the past decade. What I want to do is present to you that frame, and then tell you why that has fallen short for me why it eventually fell short for me, and then talk about how I've come to think about it now. So doing, I hope that we can give the people who are watching, translators and would-be translators, the up-and-coming, some tools that they might use themselves as they consider these questions, which are so important and can be, quite interesting and tricky to take up in this context. So, yeah, should we get started?
Sure, please.
Okay. So the frame that I've heard come up a lot in conversation with my colleagues, be they other translators or scholars, editors, and again, that I subscribe to myself for a very long time, is I'm going to call it avoiding the extremes. So what we're talking about here is the idea is we have the traditional understanding enshrined in the text on the one hand, and you have what we might call modern sensibilities on the other. And then the idea is that we would strike a middle way between these two, right? We put these in conversation and we sort of go, well, the traditional understanding was this, and the modern sensibility is this. And we try to find a middle way. And actually that kind of language that we use around, Buddhist middle way philosophy comes up a lot, right? We want to balance things. What I came to realize as I worked at that was that by positing at the outset of my reflections, two extremes to be avoided, I assumed a kind of tension between these two, right? That it's like a continuum on which I needed to place my translation. Am I an 80% traditional or at 20% modern? But in fact, the traditional understanding, right, is not an extreme we want to avoid, and neither is sort of legibility or comprehensibility, sensibility in the singular, sensibility in a modern context. Neither is that what we want to avoid, right? The traditional and the modern, these two things are both ideals to be realized. We want to be absolutely faithful to the original text, right? And we want it to be vital and sensible and in today when we read it, and sound fresh, right? Even as it's faithful. I rather started to think of them as two ideals, right? The union of two ideals. These are two ideas, the traditional, the modern, that are best realized, like wisdom and compassion, in union, right? So we want both of those in our thinking. And this little shift in the lens that I was using really started to make possible a lot of things in my translation work, in translation work, that I thought were never going to be able to happen. I thought I had to make kind of choices, that I was going to someone was going to come out slighted. And so now having understood how the assumptions I was making misled me, right? Now I had an opportunity to develop a new lens to work from, one that I'm finding more viable. So I want to pause for a second. Is that clear up to this point? Do you have any questions?
Yeah, that's really clear. Yeah, I mean, this is a really relevant topic. I mean, you probably have heard, right? Recently, there's that, I guess, incident, right, with the translation of the Therigatha that came out. Um, sort of, the translator was trying to kind of bring in modern sensibilities, but then at the same time, in a way, sort of sacrificing the originality of the original text. So there's a lot of kind of controversial takes around that issue, right, from different kinds of scholars, but also from practitioners who want to read translations that are a lot more readable. So I completely get what you're saying here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, this might be a good point to pause and say, I want to encourage. I'm not here. I'm not trying to like push a single view, right? I think we need a lot of different thinking on this point. I think on these points, and I think there is a lot for us to disagree about in a way that's exciting, right? Like different readers are going to find useful different styles of translation, and when I say different readers, I don't just mean, practitioners versus scholars. I'm talking about readers around the world, second language readers, third language readers. Like we have all kinds of needs, and there's room for a huge variety of translations. So yeah, so we've figured out that this frame that I was talking about before, the avoidance of the extremes, can be misleading, right? I found it misleading. And I've proposed this other thing, this union of the ideals. What does that mean? How are we going to do that? Well, there's two parts to it. Okay. I want to talk about nonviolence to the text. And that means not erasing. Okay. That's the first part. And the second part that I want to talk about is nonviolence to the reader. Okay. And that means not introducing into the text fresh harm. Okay. So let's look at that. So nonviolence to the text, what I'm talking about here is we don't want to leave out anything that's in the book, right? In a text, be it uncomfortable, what problematic, sometimes we say, fraught, difficult, confusing, even downright offensive, right? The program here is not that no one should ever be confronted by anything in these books. That's not at all what we're trying to do. That's a real misconception, okay? At least from my perspective. Buddhism is meant, in a sense, to be confronting. The Four Noble Truths are shaking the very foundation of what we believe about the world, right? So it's not at all the case that we're trying to elide or remove from the text anything that troubles us, okay? That would be violence to the text. We want to be nonviolent to the text, okay? Especially because if we remove from the text the things that are maybe record of historical harm, for instance, then we remove the opportunity to really grapple with that in a real way in our communities today, right? So we want to, even especially in a sense, if it's troubling, we want to kind of leave that, but translate it in a way that we can take it up today and really grapple with it. So the second part of this is nonviolent, as I said, nonviolence to the reader, the non-introduction of fresh harm. A lot of times what this means is, I would call it not adding insult to injury, right? If the text may be troublesome, it may be fraught, it may enshrine or be a record of the marginalization of certain groups of people, for instance, right? What we don't want to do when we translate those texts is, on top of that, introduce a slur, for instance, in English that was not there in the original. So that's just one example. So there's a little bit of a needle to be threaded here. And in order to talk about this, I want to bring up some kind of more specific examples.
I was just thinking about maybe a few examples would be really great.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Let's just talk about like 3 or 4 vocabulary words. People who are watching at home, because I want to get into this and be very specific, we're going to talk about some terms that have been used in the past that are considered by some folks today slurs. So if today is not your day to deal with that, to hear that, feel free to jump ahead or, go do something else for now. It's not, but I think it's worth it, considering our lofty goal here to take these things up and deal with it really seriously. So in the Vinaya, for instance, there are a number of texts in which Lord Buddha lists those persons who are barred from ordination, monastic ordination, right? And so a translator, for instance, of the last century is likely to have translated the groups of people that Lord Buddha describes something like as follows. So here's the section I'm talking about. Hermaphrodites, lepers, and the insane, right? There's just three sort of categories that you might see something like that come up. I'm not sure if lepers is an actual one, but we're just going to use that as an example. Hermaphrodites, lepers, and the insane. These, the Buddha, and then the verb is something like blocked sometimes, or sometimes it's like sends away. Blocks or bars or sends away, right? I don't like this text at all, right? In a sense, there's a sense, I love the Vinaya and I love the Buddha. No, there's no question. But I really wish this text wasn't there. I really wish the Buddha had said, everyone is welcome here and we will do everything we can to accommodate everyone. That's not what we've got, okay? That's not the text we've got. The text is in itself, for me, I'm like, oh, wow, this is something. I got to think about what this means that this text is in there, okay? However, those terms that are used there, if we go to some of the resources, I'm going to put resources in the video description below. If we go to the APA guidelines, what APA says is similar to what some of the other style guidelines say. They say, don't try to avoid defining a person or group of persons solely on the basis of a single characteristic, right? So in the case of lepers, they suggest what's called person-first language. So you say persons with leprosy, right? Or if you find that too cumbersome, then at least you can flip it and say leprotic persons or something, right? So you'd use it as an adjective, but the noun that you use has to do with personhood, right? So that we see that this is a sort of transient state potentially, or an additional state that this person is going through, not the central defining characteristic feature of who they are, right? And I find that very helpful. Now, where, for instance, hermaphrodite is concerned, this is a term that is a slur, or can be understood as a slur, right? And how do we know it's a slur? Because persons with an intersex variation, right? Intersex persons tell us it's a slur. There are those who identify as hermaphrodites, right? Because they're reclaiming the term. But in general, that term is to be avoided because they tell us it is. And also, if you look at the scientific community, the trend is away from that term. It's problematic. It's not useful. It actually, has references to a whole other religion in it. Like if they were called Christ Marys, like the Buddhist translators would have a fit. Nobody would use that term, right? So in terms of hermaphrodite, which we know is a slur, there's twice the reasons to avoid that term. And so I would suggest something like persons born with an intersex variation, right? Or persons with an intersex variation, intersex persons, something like that. Okay. I find that very useful. And so if we return to the passage we're imagining, kind of, or putting together, we can hear Lord Buddha saying, right? Persons born with an intersex variation, persons with leprosy, persons experiencing mental illness, or if you really want to go for it, you could say persons with neurodivergence or something like that. It depends on where you're comfortable. But like those persons, Lord Buddha blocks. Those persons, Lord Buddha turns away. The text is still troublesome to me. I still wish that they had been welcomed, right? But while we still make sure and not erase this historical harm, right, and allow ourselves to deal with that as a community, we also don't insult those historically marginalized people in the process. And I think that that's the starting point as a translator, is we don't want to add a fresh harm, because most of these terms in the ancient context, we know they weren't understood as slurs in the way that we understand them today, the ancient terms, because they're in Lord Buddha's mouth. and it's this, the teaching is very clear that Buddhists don't go around insulting people, like slurring people, right? That's not to say it couldn't be used as an, in a vile manner. At any rate, do you have any questions to that? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, this just reminds me of teaching when we talk about the Vinaya to undergraduate students, right, who take, let's say, Introduction to Buddhism. These kinds of claims made by the Buddha would be usually introduced, and the students will be really shocked usually, right? But when we talk about them, certain textbooks still use these terms: hermaphrodites, leopards, and also the insane, right? In their translation of the Vinaya. This kind of lineage of language still kept alive, and it could be definitely problematic, inflicting harm on students who might receive some kind of harm from these languages, but also sort of kind of keeping these terms alive in our translations is another way of continuing a certain kind of legacy of harm. So I think this also has a lot of meaning and significance in teaching as well.
Often the response to the point that I'm trying to make, which is people say, well, intersex persons, right? That's not a term that would have been in use back then. They would have used hermaphrodite. And I want to say, Lord Buddha never spoke English. Any word you use, you're putting in Buddha's mouth, right? And we're not translating only a dead sort of text or situation. This is a living tradition, and these texts represent the living tradition. And so we have a responsibility to represent the Buddha. It gets tricky. Something like the historical Buddha today, because the Buddha's speaking today, right? The Buddha's speaking today. The Buddha's not just speaking then. We're translating what the Buddha's saying today. And it's a tricky point, but I think it's really important.
Another thing that just came to my mind, I think Buddhism is very interesting because it has a particular kind of temporality, right, to it. Because the Buddha didn't really teach at one historical instance, and then his words were recorded. He actually taught in many different kinds of timescales, right? He was coming in and out. He's very cosmic, right? He appears, he teaches to different audiences in different spheres and realms. So this linear historical time is rather irrelevant to the Lord Buddha, right? Yeah. So then that means he could definitely be teaching all the time, continuously in different periods, historical periods, and to different kinds of audiences using different languages, you can even argue, right? Well, I think your advices, like the specific examples you gave, are really helpful. I think it's really clear. I definitely see how you can combine the two ideals together, and it could totally work without butchering the original text, but also making sure that we're not adding salt to injury. So it's definitely doable, and we just have to be more mindful of the choices of the words we use, and also look into the newest scholarship and the newest kind of developments in the community, right? What kinds of words are preferred by the community members themselves, and we just got to do more education, educate ourselves.
I mean, the heart of Buddhism is compassion, and the choices that we make as translators should, at base, really stem from that. And sometimes that compassion is a little more complicated, and it does mean retaining, those historical, tasty little, troubling little bits. But thank you so much for this conversation. It's so fun to meet you and talk about these things.
Yeah, me too. It's so wonderful. I'm pretty interested in your project. So you're translating with 84,000, mostly the Vinaya?
That's So we did the karmaśataka, the Legya Tamba. That's been published already in the reading room. Nice. And then we're working now also on the Vinaya Kshudraka Vastu, which includes a passage similar to the one that I was sort of imagining. We have a number of other texts which are also sort of in the editorial or translation process. So hopefully there'll be a lifetime of work. And so
yeah, we got 90 years left of translation to do, or something like that.
Including the 10-year, another 75 or 90 or something. Are you going to join us? You should join us.
I'm actually working on an application with some friends here in Santa Barbara. We'll be translating. So I think we don't really know what kind of text we'll be translating. We have to kind of work out that together. But maybe like, perfection of wisdom
Awesome.
along that line.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. I don't know what it
Oh,
would be, but
great.
for
Yeah.
sure, if it's like translators, like I love translators. I want to make so many translators. I want to see translators. Translation is an amazing job. It's so incredible, and
is.
it's really hard to like figure out and break into. You know what I mean? And I hope that those Dharma foundations and things like that out there like really support the creation and nurturing of translators, because it's a big, big job. There's so much to know, but you can totally do it. You're gonna do it.
I'm gonna do it.